Chapter 21. The Island of Tibulong. Though stunned and almost suffocated, Dantes still had the presence of mind to hold his breath, and since, as we have said, his right hand was prepared for any eventuality, holding the open knife, he quickly slit the cloth and put out his arm, then his head. But then, despite his attempts to raise the cannonball, he felt himself being continually dragged down, so he bent over to search for the rope, restraining his legs, and, with one last despairing effort, cut it just as he was suffocating. Kicking powerfully, he rose, free to the surface of the sea, while the weight dragged the coarse linen that had almost become his shroud down into the unknown depths. Dantes stayed no longer than was necessary to take a breath before diving once more. The first precaution that he had to take was to avoid being seen. When he emerged a second time, he was already at least 50 yards from the place where he had fallen. Above him he saw a black, lowering sky, across which the clouds were being rapidly swept by the wind, from time to time revealing a small patch of blue from which a star shone. In front of him was a dark, roaring plain, its waves starting to seethe as at the approach of a storm, while behind him, blacker than the sea, blacker than the sky, like a threatening phantom, rose the granite giant, its sombre peak like a hand outstretched to grasp its prey. On the topmost rock was a lantern lighting 2 human forms. It seemed to him that the 2 forms were bending uneasily over the sea. The strange gravediggers must indeed have heard the cry that escaped him as he flew through the air. So Dantes dived again and swam under water for a considerable distance. He had once been quite used to doing this, and would formerly, in the cove of the Pharaoh, have attracted many admirers around him, who often proclaimed him the most accomplished swimmer in Marseille. When he came back to the surface, the lantern had vanished. Now he must find his bearings. Of all the islands around the Château d'If, Ratonneau and Pomègue are the nearest, but Ratonneau and Pomègue are inhabited. So is the little island of Dôme. The safest landfall was therefore on either Tibulong or Le Maire, and these 2 islands lie a league away from the Château d'If. Even so, it was one of these 2 that Dantes decided to make for, but how could he find them in the depth of the night that was deepening moment by moment around him? But then, shining like a star, he noticed the Planier lighthouse. If he swam directly towards the light, he would leave Tibulong a little to his left, so if he were to swing a small distance to the left, he would be heading for the island. However, as we have said, it was at least a league from the Château d'If to Tibulong. Often in their prison, Faria had told the young man, when he saw him depressed and languid, "Dantes, you must not give way to this debility. If you do manage to escape and you have failed to keep up your strength, you will drown." Beneath the heavy, bitter swell, Dantes once more heard these words in his ears, and he hurried back to the surface to plough through the waves and test whether he had indeed lost his power. He was overjoyed to find that his enforced idleness had deprived him of none of his strength and agility, and to find that he was still master of this element in which he had gambled as a child. In any event, fear, that swift tormentor, doubled his vigour. Rising on the crest of the waves, he listened to find out if he could hear any noise. Each time that he reached the highest point of a wave, he quickly surveyed the visible horizon and tried to penetrate the blackness. Every wave that climbed a little higher than the rest looked to him like a boat pursuing him, so he strove all the harder, which certainly took him further onward, but also threatened to exhaust him more quickly. Yet he did swim, and the fearful fortress had faded somewhat into the mists of night. He could no longer see it, but he felt it still. An hour passed, during which Dantes, buoyed up by the sense of freedom that had spread through his whole body, continued to drive on through the waves on the course he had set himself. Now, let's see, he thought. I have been swimming for almost an hour, but with a contrary wind I must have lost a quarter of my speed. However, unless I have mistaken the direction, I must now be close to the island of Tibulong. But what if I am mistaken? The swimmer felt a shudder pass through him. He tried to float for a moment to give himself a rest, but the sea was getting heavier all the time, and he soon realized that such respite, which he had counted on having, was impossible. "Well, so be it," he said. "I shall go on until the end, until my arms fail, until cramp seizes my whole body, and then I shall sink." And he began to swim with the energy and urgency of despair. Suddenly it seemed that the sky, already so dark, grew still darker, and that a thick, heavy, impenetrable cloud was coming down over him. At the same time he felt a sharp pain in his knee. His imagination immediately told him that this must be the shock of a bullet, and that he would instantly hear the report of a rifle, but there was no explosion. Dantès put out his hand and felt something. He brought up his other leg and touched solid ground. It was then that he saw what it was he had taken for a cloud. 20 yards ahead of him rose a mass of oddly shaped rocks that looked like a vast fire, solidified just at the moment when it was burning most fiercely. This was the island of Tibulong. Dantès stood up and took a few steps forward. Then he lay down, thanking God, on these points of granite that seemed softer to him at that moment than the softest bed. Then, despite the wind, despite the storm, despite the rain that was starting to fall, exhausted as he was, he fell asleep with that delicious sleep of the man whose body is numbed, but whose mind is awake to the knowledge of unhoped-for good fortune. After an hour, Edmund woke to the sound of an immense clap of thunder. The storm had broken in the heavens and was beating the air with its flashing light. From time to time a shaft of lightning shot from the sky like a fiery snake, illuminating the waves and the clouds that plunged headlong after each other like the breakers of a vast abyss. Dantès, with his sailor's eye, had judged rightly. He had landed on the first of the 2 islands, which is Tibulong. He knew that it was a naked rock, open to the elements and shelterless. When the storm was over, he would plunge back into the sea and make for the island of Le Maire, no less deserted but wider and consequently more welcoming. An overhanging rock did offer him some temporary shelter, and he took refuge under it. At almost the same moment, the storm broke in all its fury. Edmund felt the rock beneath which he was hiding tremble, and the waves breaking against the base of the huge pyramid reached his hiding place. Safe as he was, in the midst of this shattering noise and these blinding flashes of light, he was seized with a sort of dizziness. He felt as though the very island were shaking beneath him, and from one moment to the next would break its moorings like a vessel at anchor and drag him down with it into the midst of the huge maelstrom. At this, he remembered that he had not eaten for 24 hours. He was hungry and thirsty. He stretched out his hands and his neck and drank some rainwater from a hollow in the rock. As he was lifting his head, a shaft of lightning, which seemed to crack open the heavens as far as the foot of God's radiant throne, lit up the scene. By its light, Dantès saw a little fishing boat appear, like a phantom slipping from the crest of a wave into the abyss, driven forward both by the waves and by the storm, between the Île Le Maire and the Cap Crocil, a quarter of a league away from him. A second later the phantom reappeared on the crest of another wave, coming towards him at fearful speed. Dantès wanted to shout. He looked for a scrap of cloth that he could wave in the air to show them that they were heading for destruction, but they could see it perfectly well for themselves. In the light of another shaft of lightning, the young man saw 4 men hanging on to the masts and the rigging, while a 5th held the bar of a broken helm. No doubt these men whom he saw could also see him, for desperate cries were carried across to him on the whistling gusts. Above the mast, twisted like a reed, a tattered sail was flapping rapidly over and over against the air. Suddenly the ropes that still held it broke, and it vanished, carried away into the dark depths of the sky, like a great white bird silhouetted against a black cloud. At the same time he heard a fearful crack and cries of agony. Grasping his rock like a sphinx above the abyss, Dantes glimpsed the little boat in the light of another flash, broken. Amid its wreckage, heads with terrified faces and hands reached for the sky. Then darkness returned, and the awful scene had lasted the lifetime of a lightning bolt. Dantes hastened down the slippery rocks, at the risk of himself falling into the sea. He looked, listened, but could only hear and see nothing. No more cries, no more human struggle. Only the storm, that great act of God, continued to roar with the wind and to foam with the waves. Little by little the wind subsided. Westwards across the sky rolled huge grey clouds which seemed to have been discoloured by the storm. Patches of blue sky reappeared with stars that shone brighter than ever. Soon, in the east, a long reddish band lit up the undulating blue-black line of the horizon. The waves danced, and instantly a light sped across their crests, transforming each one into a mane of gold. Day was breaking. Dantes remained motionless and silent before this great spectacle, as if seeing it for the first time. Indeed, in all the years that he had been at the Château d'If, he had forgotten it. He turned back to look at the fortress, sweeping his eyes across the whole arc of the land and the sea. The dark pile rose out of the midst of the waves with the imposing majesty common to all motionless objects which seem at once to watch and to command. It must have been about 5 o'clock. The sea was growing calmer all the time. In 2 or 3 hours, Edmund thought, the turnkey will go into my room, find the body of my poor friend, recognise it, look in vain for me and give the alarm. Then they will find the hole and the tunnel. They will question the men who threw me into the sea, who must have heard me cry out. Immediately ships full of soldiers will set out in pursuit of the unfortunate fugitive, who cannot have gone far. The cannon will be fired to warn everyone on the coast not to give shelter to any man who appears, naked and starving. The spies of Marseille will be informed. They will search the coast while the governor of the Château d'If will be searching the sea. So, hunted down at sea, hemmed in on land, what will become of me? I am hungry and thirsty. I've even lost my life-saving knife because it hampered me whilst I was swimming. I am at the mercy of the first peasant who wants to earn 20 francs by handing me in. I have no strength, no ideas, no resolve left. Oh, God, haven't I suffered enough? Now, can you do more for me than I can do for myself? Just as Edmund was uttering this ardent prayer, in a sort of delirium due to his exhaustion and the lightness of his head, and anxiously turning towards the Château d'If, he saw off the point of the Île de Pommeil, its lateen sail against the horizon like a seagull skimming the waves, a little ship which only the eye of a sailor would have recognized as a Genoese tartan, which appeared on the still indistinct line of the sea. It was coming from the port of Marseille and heading out to sea, driving the shining spray in front of a sharp prow that cut the sea ahead of its swelling sides. "Just think," Edmund exclaimed, "in half an hour I could have reached that ship, if I were not afraid of being questioned, recognised as an escaped prisoner and taken back to Marseille. What can I do? What can I say? What story can I invent to deceive them? These people are all smugglers, nearly pirates. Pretending to ply the coast, they scour it for booty. They would rather sell me than do a good deed for nothing. Let's wait." "But it is impossible to wait. I'm dying of hunger. In a few hours I shall have exhausted the little strength that remains to me. In any case, the time of the warder's rounds is approaching. The alarm has not yet been sounded, so perhaps they will suspect nothing. I can pretend to be one of the sailors from that little boat which sank last night. This is a plausible enough story. No one will be able to contradict me, since the whole crew is drowned. Let's go." As he said these words, Dantes looked towards the place where the little ship had foundered, and shuddered. The Phrygian cap of one of the drowned sailors was hanging from the jagged edge of a rock, and near it some wreckage from the ship's hull was floating, dead beams that the sea drove against the base of the island, which they hammered like powerless battering rams. In an instant, Dantes had made up his mind. He plunged back into the sea, swam towards the cap, put it on his head, grasped hold of one of the beams, and set a course that would take him to meet up with the boat. "Now I am saved," he muttered, and the certainty gave him strength. He soon saw the tartan, which, as it was sailing almost directly into the wind, was tacking between the Château d'If and the Tour de Planier. For a moment Dantes was afraid that, instead of hugging the coast, the little ship would head out to sea, as it would have done, for example, had it been bound for Corsica or Sardinia. But from the way it was manoeuvring, the swimmer soon realised that it intended to pass between the islands of Jar and Casserène. However, the ship and the swimmer were gradually converging. As it tacked in one direction, the little ship even came to about a quarter of a league from Dantes. He rose up in the sea and waved his cap as a distress signal, but no one on the ship saw him, and it went about to begin tacking in the other direction. Dantes thought of calling out, but he assessed the distance and realised that his voice could not reach the ship, but would be carried away on the sea breeze and covered by the noise of the waves. Now he congratulated himself for having had the foresight to lie on a beam. Weak as he was, he might not have been able to keep afloat until he reached the tartan, and certainly if, as was quite possible, the tartan passed without seeing him, he would not have been able to reach the shore. Though he was almost certain of the course that the boat had set, Dantes looked anxiously after it until the moment when he saw it tack again and return towards him. Then he swam to meet it. But before their paths had crossed, the boat began to turn. Immediately summoning all his strength, Dantes rose almost out of the water, waved his cap, and gave one of those pitiful cries of a sailor in distress which sound like the wailing of some genie of the sea. This time he was seen and heard. The tartan changed course and turned towards him. At the same time he saw that they were preparing to put a boat into the sea. A moment later the boat, rowed by two men, their oars striking the sea, was coming towards him. Dantes let go of the beam, thinking he would no longer need it, and swam vigorously to halve the distance between himself and his saviours. However, he had counted on strength that had almost deserted him. Now he realised how much that piece of wood, already floating inertly 100 yards away, had helped him. His arms began to stiffen, his legs had lost their suppleness, his movements became forced and jerky, and his chest heaved. He let out a great cry. The two rowers increased their efforts, and one called out in Italian, "Coraggio!" The word reached him just as a wave, which he no longer had the strength to ride above, broke over his head and drenched him in spray. He reappeared, thrashing the sea with the uneven, desperate movements of a drowning man, cried out a third time, and felt himself sinking into the sea, as if he still had the fatal cannonball attached to his legs. The water closed over his head, and above the water he saw a livid sky speckled with black. One last superhuman effort brought him back to the surface of the sea. Then it seemed to him that someone had grasped him by the hair, and he saw and heard nothing more. He had lost consciousness. When he next opened his eyes, he was on the deck of the tartan, which was under way again. The first thing he did was to look to see what course it was following, if it was still sailing away from the Château d'If. Dantes was so exhausted that his exclamation of joy was taken for a cry of pain. As we said, he was lying on the deck. A sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen blanket, while another, whom he recognised as the one who had shouted "Coraggio," was putting the lip of a gourd to his mouth. A third, an old sailor, who was both the pilot and the master, looked at him with the selfish pity that men usually feel towards a misfortune that they escaped only the day before, and which might be waiting for them on the following one. A few drops of rum from the gourd stimulated the young man's heart, while the massage that the other sailor was still giving him with the wool, kneeling in front of him, gave some movement back to his limbs. "Who are you?" the master asked in broken French. "I am a Maltese seaman," Dantes replied in broken Italian. "We were sailing from Syracuse with a cargo of wine and panoline. The squall last night surprised us off Cap Monjou, and we found it against those rocks that you see over there." "And where have you come from?" "From those same rocks on which I had the good fortune to wash up, while our poor captain's head was broken against them. Our 3 companions were drowned. I think I must be the only one left alive. I saw your ship, and, fearing that I might have to wait a long time on that isolated desert island, I took my chances on a piece of the wreckage from our boat to try and reach you. Thank you," Dantes went on. "You have saved my life. I was exhausted when one of your sailors grasped me by the hair." "That was me," said a sailor with a frank and open face, framed in long side whiskers. "It was none too soon. You were going under." "Yes," Dantes said, offering his hand. "Yes, my friend, I thank you once more." "Damn it," said the sailor, "I was almost reluctant to do it. With your 6-inch beard and your hair a full foot long, you look more like a brigand than an honest sailor." Dantes remembered that he had indeed not cut his hair or shaved his beard in the whole time he was in the Château d'If. "Yes," he said, "this was a vow that I made to Our Lady of Pia della Grotta in a moment of danger, to go 10 years without cutting my hair or my beard. Today sees the expiation of my vow, and I nearly drowned on the anniversary of it." "Now, what are we going to do with you?" asked the master. "Alas," Dantes replied, "you can do what you like. The felucca on which I was sailing is lost. The captain is dead. As you can see, I escaped his fate, but totally naked. Luckily, I am a fairly good sailor. Put me off at the first port where you make land, and I shall always find employment on some merchant vessel." "Do you know the Mediterranean?" "I have been sailing around it since my childhood." "You know the best anchorages?" "There are few ports, even the most difficult, where I could not sail in or out with my eyes closed." "Well, how about it, patron?" said the sailor who had cried Coraggio to Dantes. "If what this comrade says is true, why shouldn't he stay with us?" "Yes, if it is true," said the master, looking doubtful. "But in the present state of this poor devil, one may promise a lot, meaning to do what one can." "I shall do even more than I have promised," said Dantes. The master laughed. "We'll see about that." "Whenever you wish," Dantes replied, getting up. "Where are you headed?" "To Leghorn." "Well then, instead of tacking and wasting precious time, why don't you simply sail closer into the wind?" "Because we would be heading directly for the Ile de Rioux." "You will be more than 120 feet away from it." "Take the helm then," said the master, "and let's judge your skill." The young man sat at the helm, touched it lightly to verify that the boat was responsive. Seeing that it was reasonably so, though not of the finest class, he said, "All hands to the rigging." The 4 members of the crew ran to their posts, while the master looked on. "Haul away!" The sailors obeyed quite effectively. "Now make fast." This order was carried out as the first 2 had been, and the little ship, instead of continuing to tack, began to make for the Ile de Rioux, passing near it and leaving it off the starboard side, at about the distance Dantes had predicted. "Bravo!" said the master. "Bravo!" the sailors repeated, all looking with wonder at this man whose face had recovered a look of intelligence, and whose body possessed a strength that they had not suspected. "You see," Dantes said, leaving the helm, "I might be of some use to you, at least during the crossing. If you want to leave me in Leghorn, you can do so. I shall repay you for my food up to that time, and for the clothes that you will lend me out of my first month's pay." "Very well then," said the master. "We can come to some arrangement if you are reasonable." "One man is worth as much as another," said Dantès. "Give me what you give to my companions, and we shall be quits." "That's not fair," said the sailor who had pulled Dantès out of the sea. "You know more than we do." "Who the devil asked you? Is this any of your business, Jacopo?" said the master. "Every man is free to sign on at the rate which suits him." "Correct," said Jacopo. "I was just commenting." "Well, you would do better to lend this poor lad a pair of trousers and a jacket if you have any to spare. He's stark naked." "I haven't," said Jacopo, "but I do have a shirt and trousers." "That is all I need," said Dantès. "Thank you, my friend." Jacopo slid down the hatch and returned a moment later with the 2 articles of clothing, which Dantès was unspeakably happy to put on. "Do you need anything else?" said the master. "A scrap of bread and another draught of that excellent rum that you gave me. I have not eaten for a long time." It was, in fact, around 40 hours. They brought Dantès a piece of bread, and Jacopo offered him the flask. "Hard a port!" the captain cried, turning to the helmsman. Dantès looked in the same direction as he put the flask to his lips, but it stopped halfway. "Look there!" the master exclaimed. "What is going on at the Château d'If?" A little puff of white smoke, which is what had caught Dantès' attention, had just appeared above the battlements of the south tower of the fortress. A second later, the sound of a distant explosion reached the tartan. The sailors looked up and exchanged glances. "What does that mean?" the master asked. "Some prisoner escaped last night, and they are firing the warning gun," said Dantès. The master looked at the young man who, as he spoke the words, brought the flask to his lips. He drank the liquid with such calm and satisfaction that, if the master had felt the shadow of a doubt, it would immediately have been dispelled. "This rum is devilish strong," Dantès said, wiping the sweat from his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. "In any case," the master thought, looking at him, "even if it is him, so much the better. I have gained a fine man." Pretending that he was tired, Dantès asked if he could sit at the helm. The helmsman, delighted to be relieved of his job, looked at the master, who nodded to let him know that he could hand the bar over to his new companion. From this vantage point, Dantès could remain with eyes fixed towards Marseille. "What day of the month is it?" Dantès asked Jacopo, who had come to sit next to him, as they lost sight of the Château d'If. "February the 28th, he replied. "And what year?" "What do you mean, what year? Are you asking me what year it is?" "Yes," said the young man, "I am asking you the year." "You've forgotten what year we're in?" "What do you expect? I was so terrified last night," Dantès said, laughing. "I nearly lost my mind. As it is, my memory is troubled. So I am asking you, this is the 28th of February of what year?" "Of the year 1829, said Jacopo. 14 years earlier, to the day, Dantès had been arrested. He had entered the Château d'If at the age of 19, and was now emerging from it at 33. A pained smile crossed his lips. He was wondering what had become of Mercedes during this time, when she must have thought him dead. Then a spark of hatred lit up in his eyes when he thought of the 3 men who were responsible for his long, cruel captivity, and once more he vowed that same implacable oath of vengeance that he had already taken in prison against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort. But now the oath was no longer an empty threat, because the finest fully manned sailing ship in the Mediterranean could surely not have overtaken the little tartan which was making for Leghorn at full speed. And I might actually possibly either take a break there or stop, because my internet has been just rubbish. Has it just been buffering for everyone? Also, hello Speedy, and thanks for subbing. I hope you're doing okay. And welcome. Yeah, has the buffering been really bad? It's like stream-stoppingly bad? Because, yeah, if so, I don't want to make people sit through loads of buffering. I love the fact that just punch the mic. I love the fact that now it decides to be fine, and when I'm actually reading, it decides not to be. But if it's... Oh, it's been pretty okay for you. Alright, okay. Yeah, I was just asking, buffering-wise, how bad's it been? You've had a few buffers. You've been enjoying the story. It's just a couple of stutters. Okay, well, in that case, I will take an early break. And maybe I'll take 2 breaks. Who knows? Maybe I'll take 1 break now and 1 break a little bit later. Maybe the internet will decide to behave. But yes, I shall take a break for now. So I hope you all can do the same. Go do the stuff. All of the things. And yep, see you in about 5 minutes. Bye for now.
Right. Internet? Has internet decided to be nice? Let's hope so. Also, apologies for break being slightly longer than usual. I decided, to make myself a hot chocolate because I have the means to make that at the moment. Because apparently my brother, he got a big box of like hot chocolate, like the like basically lump of chocolate on a stick that you put into hot milk. He had a box of them for Christmas and didn't like 2 of them, so they're now mine. So I've got a orange hot chocolate, which is quite nice. But yes, let's hope the internet holds. And also, thanks for asking how I am, Umika. I am doing okay, thank you. Bit of a meh day, but seems a lot of people have had that today. I do also have now actual sounds of rain on my windows, which is quite nice. You're probably not getting any of that through the mic, given that you'll just be getting the rain sound from the actual from the rain sound on the stream, but it is nice to have it in real life. And that hot chocolate is far too hot to drink. And the internet's decided to go red again. Oh well, we'll see what happens. Right. I hope you all had a nice break. And we shall continue. And I put my headphones on like a fool again. Why do I keep doing that? It's just the automatic thing of doing anything stream related or online is like, headphones. You can hear fine, good. Right. Chapter 22. The Smugglers. Dantes had not been a day on board before he realised the sort of people he was dealing with. Without ever having had lessons from Abbe Faria, the worthy master of the Jeune Amélie, as the Genoese tartan was called, was acquainted with more or less every language spoken around the great lake known as the Mediterranean, from Arabic to Provençal. This relieved him of the need to employ an interpreter, a class of people who are always bothersome and sometimes indiscreet, and made it easy for him to communicate, whether with any ships that he might encounter at sea, or with the little boats that he met along the coasts, or finally with those people without name, nationality, or evident profession, who are always to be found on the paved quaysides of seaports, living on mysterious and secret resources which one can only believe must come to them directly from Providence, since they have no other visible means of support. The reader may have guessed that Dantes was on a smuggler's ship. For this reason the master had been slightly suspicious about taking him on board. He was well known to all the customs officers along the coast, engaging with these gentlemen in a mutual exchange of stratagems even more cunning than the last, so he had at first thought that Dantes was an emissary of my lords the excisemen, who were using this ingenious method to root out some of the secrets of his trade. But the brilliance with which Dantes had succeeded in the test of fine navigation had entirely convinced him. Then, at the sight of the puff of smoke rising like a plume over the Château d'If, and the distant sound of the explosion, he momentarily guessed that he had just taken on board one of those men, in this respect like kings, whose entrances and exits are honoured by the firing of cannon. This bothered him less, it must be said, than if the newcomer had been a customs officer, and this new suspicion vanished like its predecessor when he saw how perfectly calm his latest recruit remained. In this way, Edmund had the advantage of knowing what his master was, while his master did not know the same about him. Whatever the old seaman and his crew questioned him, and on whatever subject, he held firm and confessed nothing, giving a wealth of details about Naples or Malta, both of which he knew as well as he knew Marseille, and sticking to his first story with a consistency that was a credit to his memory. Thus the Genoan, wily as he was, let himself be taken in by Edmund, thanks to the young man's gentle manner, his experience of the sea, and, above all, his unusual skill at deception. But then, perhaps the Genoan was like those clever men who never know more than they need and believe only what is in their interests to believe. This was the situation when they arrived at Leghorn. Here Edmund had to face a new trial. He had to find out if he would recognise himself, not having seen his own face for 14 years. He could remember the young man quite clearly. Now he would discover what he had become as a mature one. As far as his companions were concerned, he had fulfilled his vow. He had already been 20 times to Leghorn and knew a barber in the Rue Saint-Fernand. That was where he went to have his beard shaved and his hair cut. The barber looked with astonishment at this man, with his long hair and thick black beard, who resembled one of those fine heads by Titian. At that time it was not yet the fashion to wear one's beard and hair long. Nowadays a barber would rather be surprised that a man who could enjoy such physical attributes should wish to deprive himself of them. He said nothing and set about his work. When it was done, when Edmund felt his chin to be clean-shaven, and when his hair had been shortened to normal length, he asked for a mirror and looked in it. Dantes was now 33 years old, as we have said, and his 14 years in prison had brought what might be described as a great spiritual change to his features. He had entered the Château d'If with the round, full, radiant face of a contented young man, whose first steps in life have been easy, and who looks to the future as a natural extension of the past. All that had changed utterly. His oval face had lengthened, and his once merry lips had adopted a fixed, firm line that spoke of stern resolve. His eyebrows arched under a single pensive line, and his eyes themselves were imprinted with deep sadness, behind which from time to time could be seen dark flashes of misanthropy and hatred. His complexion, kept so long from daylight and the sun, had taken on the dull tones that give such aristocratic beauty to men of the north when black hair frames their faces. Moreover, the knowledge that he had acquired gave a look of intelligent self-confidence to his whole face. Though naturally quite tall, his body had taken on the compact vigour of one that has learnt to concentrate all its strength within itself. The elegance of lean, nervous limbs had been replaced by the solidity of a well-built, muscular man. His voice, accustomed to prayers, sobs and curses, had at times a strangely soft resonance, at others a rough edge that was almost husky. In addition, having been constantly in darkness or half-light, his eyes had acquired the remarkable ability of seeing in the dark, like those of wolves and hyenas. Edmund smiled when he saw himself. It would have been impossible for his best friend, if he had any friends left, to recognise him. He didn't recognise himself. The master of the Jeune Amélie, who was very keen to keep someone of Edmund's ability in his crew, had offered him an advance on his share of future profits, and Edmund had accepted. So the first thing he did on leaving the barber's, where he had undergone this preliminary metamorphosis, was to find a shop where he could buy a complete set of seaman's clothes. Of course, this is very simple, consisting of white trousers, a striped shirt, and a Phrygian cap. Edmund returned the trousers and shirt that Jacopo had lent him, and appeared in his new dress before the master of the Jeune Amélie, who asked him to repeat his story. The master could hardly recognise the heavily bearded man, half drowned and with seaweed in his hair, whom he had brought, naked and dying, onto the deck of his ship, in this smartly dressed and stylish sailor. Encouraged by this change in appearance, he repeated his offer to take Dantes on, but Dantes would accept it only for 3 months. He had plans of his own. The crew of the Jeune Amélie was a very busy one, and subject to a master who was not used to wasting time. They had been hardly a week in Leghorn before the ship's swelling hold was full of coloured muslin, forbidden cotton cloth, English powder, and tobacco, on which the state monopoly had forgotten to put its stamp. They had to get all this out of Leghorn, duty paid, and unload it on the Corsican coast, from where certain speculators would take charge of conveying it to France. They set sail, and Edmund found himself once more crossing the azure sea that had been the first horizon of his youth, and which he had seen so often in his prison dreams. Leaving the Gorgone on their right and the Pianosa on their left, they set out for the birthplace of Paoli and Napoleon. Coming up on deck early the following day, as was his custom, the master found Dantes leaning against the side of the ship, with a strange look on his face as he stared out towards a heap of granite that the rising sun was bathing in a rosy light. The island of Monte Cristo. The Jeune Amélie passed, some 3/4 of a league to starboard, and they continued to make for Corsica. As they sailed past this island, the name of which held such significance for him, Dantes was thinking that he had only to leap into the sea, and within half an hour he would be in this promised land. But what would he do there, with no tools to recover his treasure, and no weapons to defend himself? In any case, what would the sailors say? What would the master think? He must wait. Waiting, fortunately, was something he knew how to do. He had waited 14 years for his freedom, and now that he was free, he could easily wait for 6 months or a year to obtain his wealth. Would he not have chosen freedom without wealth if he had been offered it? In any case, was the wealth not an illusion which had been born in poor Abbe Faria's sick brain and died with him? Yet Cardinal Spada's letter was oddly precise, and Dantes repeated it in his head from beginning to end. He had not forgotten a single word. Evening came. Edmund watched the island pass through all the colours of sunset and dusk, then fade into the darkness for all except himself. His eyes, accustomed to the darkness of a prison cell, doubtless continued to make out the island, since he was the last to leave the deck. The next day they woke up off Aleria. All day they tacked backwards and forwards, and in the evening bonfires were lit on shore. The placing of the fires must have shown that it was safe to disembark, because a lantern took the place of the flag on the little ship's yard arm, and they sailed to within gunshot range of the coast. Dantes had noticed that, approaching land on what he must consider solemn occasions, the master of the Jeune Amélie would set up 2 little culverines on pivots, of the sort that might be used in defending a rampart, and which, without making much noise, would project a 1/4-pound shot 1,000 paces. This evening, however, the precaution proved unnecessary. Everything went off as peacefully and as genteelly as might be imagined. 4 launches rowed quietly over to the ship, which, no doubt to welcome them, put its own launch into the water, and between them the 5 rowing boats had laboured so hard that, by 2 o'clock in the morning, the whole cargo had been transferred from the Jeune Amélie to dry land. The master of the ship was a man of such well-regulated habits that the very same night the bounty had been divided up. Each man had his share, 100 Tuscan lire, which is about 80 francs in our money. But the voyage was not over. They set course for Sardinia, with a view to reloading the vessel that had just been unloaded. This second operation went as smoothly as the first. The Jeune Amélie was in luck. The new cargo was destined for the Duchy of Lucca. It was almost entirely composed of Havana cigars, sherry and Malaga wine. Here, however, they had a brush with the excise, that eternal enemy of the Jeune Amélie's master. A customs officer was laid low, and 2 sailors were wounded. Dantes was one of them. A shot passed through his left shoulder, leaving a flesh wound. He was almost happy at this skirmish and his wound. These hard tutors had taught him how he viewed danger and bore suffering. He had laughed at danger, and, as the shot pierced him, had said, like a Greek philosopher, "Pain, you are not an evil." Moreover, he had looked at the mortally wounded customs man, and, whether because his blood was up or because his feelings were chilled, the sight made very little impression on him. Dantes was on the track that he wished to follow, proceeding towards the end that he wished to attain. His heart was turning to stone in his breast. Jacopo, seeing him fall, had thought him dead and rushed to his side, raised him up, and finally, when he was under cover, tended him like the good friend he was. In short, could it be that the world was neither as good as Dr. Pangloss pretended, nor as bad as it seemed to Dantès, since this man, who had nothing to expect from his friend except to inherit his part of the bounty, had felt such distress at seeing him fall dead? Happily, as we have said, Dantès was only wounded. With the help of some herbs picked at special times and sold to the smugglers by old Sardinian women, the wound quickly healed. Sir Edmund wanted to tempt Jacopo. As a reward for his care, he offered him his share of the bounty, but Jacopo refused indignantly. As a result of this kind of sympathetic devotion that Jacopo had accorded to Edmund from the first moment that they met, Edmund conceded a certain degree of affection to Jacopo. The latter asked for nothing better. He had perceived in Edmund a great superiority to his present state, something that Edmund had managed to conceal from the others, so the good sailor was satisfied with the little that Edmund gave him. In this way, during the long days on board, when the ship was safely gliding across an azure sea with a favourable wind swelling its sails, and needing no more than the attention of its helmsman, Edmund would take a chart of the coast, and make himself Jacopo's instructor, as poor Abbé Faria had become Edmund's. He showed him how to take bearings in coastal waters, explained the compass to him, and taught him to read in that great open book above our heads which is called the sky, and in which God writes on the blue firmament in diamond letters. When Jacopo asked him, "What is the use of teaching all these things to a poor sailor like me?" Edmund replied, "Who knows? One day you may be captain of a ship. Your fellow countryman Bonaparte became emperor." We forgot to mention that Jacopo was a Corsican. 2.5 months passed in such successive journeys. Edmund had become as skilled in navigating the coastal waters as he had once been on the open sea. He got to know all the smugglers around the Mediterranean, and learned the Masonic signs that these semi-pirates used to recognize one another. 20 times he had sailed one way or the other past his island of Monte Cristo, but not once had he found an opportunity to land there. So he made a resolution, which was that, as soon as his contract with the master of the Jeune Amélie came to an end, he would hire a little boat on his own account, which he could well do, having saved around 100 piastres on his different voyages, and on some pretext or other sail to Monte Cristo. There he would be free to hunt for his treasure. Well, not entirely free, since he would no doubt be spied upon by those who had crossed with him. But in this world one must learn to take some risks. However, prison had made Edmund cautious, and he would have preferred not to risk anything. Hard though he tried, and fertile though his imagination was, he could not find any other means of reaching the island except to get someone to take him there. Dantès was still racked by doubt when one evening the master, who had great confidence in him and was very anxious to retain his services as a member of his crew, took his arm and led him to a tavern in the Via dell'Olio, where the cream of the smuggling profession in Leghorn was accustomed to meet. This is where affairs along the coast were usually discussed. Dantès had already been to this maritime exchange 2 or 3 times, and at the sight of these bold buccaneers, the product of a coast of some 2,000 leagues in circumference, he had wondered what power a man might wield if his will could manage to direct all these divergent or united threads. This time an important matter was under discussion. There was a ship loaded with Turkish carpets and cloth from the Levant and Kashmir. They had to find some neutral ground on which the exchange could take place before bringing these goods to the coast of France. The bounty was so large that if they were successful, each man should have 50 or 60 piastres. The master of the Jeune Amélie proposed disembarking on the island of Monte Cristo. Since it was deserted and there were no soldiers or customs men on it, it seemed to have been set down in the midst of the sea in the days of the pagan Olympus by Mercury, god of tradesmen and thieves, two sorts of people whom we consider separate, if not entirely distinct, but whom antiquity seems to have classed together. At the name of Monte Cristo, Dantes trembled with joy. He got up to hide his emotion and paced round the smoke-filled tavern, in which every dialect of the known world was blended into a single lingua franca. When he returned to the discussion, it had been decided that they would land on Monte Cristo, setting off on this expedition the following night. Edmund was consulted, and he confirmed that the island offered the greatest possible security, and that, if they were to succeed, great enterprises needed to be undertaken promptly. So the plan was adhered to, and it was agreed that they would get under way the following evening, meaning, if they had a calm sea and a favourable wind, that the day after next they would find themselves in the waters off the shore of the neutral island. Chapter 23. The Island of Monte Cristo. At last, by one of those unexpected chances which sometimes happen to people on whom misfortune has exhausted its ingenuity, Dantes was going to reach his goal by a simple, natural means and set foot on his island without arousing any suspicion. Only one night separated him from this long-awaited departure. That night was one of the least restful that Dantes had ever spent. In the course of it he ran over every good and bad eventuality in his mind. If he closed his eyes, he saw Cardinal Spada's letter written in blazing letters on the wall. If he fell asleep for a moment, the most insane dreams raced around his skull. He was going down into caves paved with emeralds, with walls of ruby and diamond stalactites. Pearls fell drop by drop in place of the water that habitually filters through the ground. Edmund, delighted, wondering, filled his pockets with precious stones, then clambered up into the daylight, only to find them turned into nothing but ordinary rocks. Then he tried to get back into the marvellous caverns, which he had only glimpsed, but the path twisted into infinite spirals, and the entrance had become invisible. He searched through his tired brain for the mysterious, magic word that had opened the wonderful caves of Ali Baba to the Arab fisherman, but all in vain. The vanished treasure had reverted to the ownership of the genie of the earth, from whom he had momentarily hoped to ravish it. Daylight found him almost as feverish as he had been at night, but it also brought logic to assist at imagination, and Dantes managed to draw up a plan that had until now been only vaguely outlined in his mind. With evening came the preparations for departure. These preparations gave Dantes an opportunity to hide his anxiety. Bit by bit, he had acquired an authority over his companions that allowed him to give orders as though he were the captain of the vessel, and since his orders were always clear, precise, and easy to carry out, the crew obeyed him not only promptly, but with pleasure. The old seaman let him do as he pleased. He too had recognised Dantes' superiority both to the others and to himself. He saw the young man as his natural successor, and regretted that he did not have a daughter so that he might bind Edmund to him in that way. At 7 o'clock all was ready, and at 10 past they rounded the lighthouse, just as it was being lit. The sea was calm, with a fresh wind from the south-east. They were sailing under a clear sky in which God too was progressively putting on his lights, each another world. Dantes announced that everyone could go to bed and that he would take over the helm. When the Maltese, as they called him, made such an announcement, that was enough for everyone, and they all went easily to bed. This sometimes happened. From time to time, Dantes, driven out of solitude into the world, felt an imperative need for solitude. And what solitude is more vast and more poetic than that of a ship sailing alone on the sea in the darkness of the night and the silence of infinity? This time his solitude was peopled with thoughts, the night illuminated by his dreams and the silence riven with his promises. When the master woke up, the ship was proceeding under full sail. There was not an inch of canvas that was not swollen by the wind. They were travelling at more than 2.5 leagues an hour. The island of Monte Cristo was rising before them on the horizon. Edmund handed the ship back to its owner and went to take his turn in his hammock. Despite a night without sleep, he could not shut his eyes for an instant. 2 hours later he returned on deck. The ship was just rounding Elba. They were abreast of Marciana and had just passed the flat green island of La Pianosa. The blazing summit of Monte Cristo could be seen, reaching into the heavens. Dantes ordered the helmsman to turn to port, so that they would leave La Pianosa on their right. He had reckoned that this manoeuvre would shorten the distance by 2 or 3 knots. Around 5 in the evening they could see the whole of the island. Every detail of it was clear, thanks to that clarity of the air which is peculiar to the light of the dying sun. Edmund gazed hungrily on the mass of rocks as they passed through all the colours of sunset, from bright pink to dark blue. From time to time he flushed warmly, his forehead became congested, and a purple haze crossed before his eyes. No gambler whose whole fortune is staked on a single roll of the dice has ever experienced the agony that Edmund did in his paroxysms of hope. Night fell. At 10 o'clock they dropped anchor. The Jeune Amélie was the first to reach the rendezvous. Despite his usual self-control, Dantes could not contain himself. He was the first to leap on shore, and, if he had dared, he would have kissed the soil like Brutus. It was pitch black, but at 11 o'clock the moon rose over the sea, throwing a silver light on every crest. Then, as it rose higher, its rays began to tumble in white cascades of light over the piled rocks of this other Pelion. The crew of the Jeune Amélie were familiar with the island. It was one of their usual points of call. Dantes, on the other hand, had recognised it from each of his voyages to the Near East, but had never stopped off here. "Where are we going to spend the night?" "On board, of course," Jacopo replied. "Wouldn't we be better in the caves?" "What caves?" "The ones on the island." "I don't know any caves," Jacopo said. A cold sweat broke out on Dantes's forehead. "There are no caves on Monte Cristo?" he asked. "No." For a moment he was stunned. Then he thought that the caves might have been filled in by some accident, or even blocked by Cardinal Spada himself as an extra precaution. The main thing in that case would be to find the lost entrance. There was no point in looking at night, so Dantes put off his search until the next day. In any case, a signal displayed by a boat some half a league out to sea, to which the Jeune Amélie responded immediately with the same, showed that the time had come to set to work. The second ship, reassured by the signal which told the late arrival that it was safe to make land, soon appeared, white and silent as a ghost, and dropped anchor a cable's length from the shore. The transfer of goods began immediately. As he worked, Dantes thought of the shout of joy that he could have brought from all these men with a single word if he had spoken aloud the thought that hummed incessantly in his ears and his heart. But, far from revealing the marvellous secret, he was already afraid he might have said too much, or that, by his coming and going, his repeated questions, his minute observations, and his constant preoccupation, he might have aroused some suspicion. It was fortunate, at least in these circumstances, that an unhappy past had stamped his features with an indelible air of sadness, and that one could perceive only brief flashes of the lights of merriment hovering beneath this cloud. No one suspected anything, and when the next day Dantes took a gun, some shot and powder, and said he would like to go and shoot 1 or 2 of the wild goats that could be seen leaping from rock to rock, his expedition was ascribed purely to love of hunting and a desire for solitude. Only Jacopo insisted on following him. Dantes did not want to object, fearing that any reluctance to take a companion with him might awaken suspicion. But they had gone hardly a quarter of a league when, seizing the opportunity to shoot a kid, he told Jacopo to take it back to the crew, suggesting that they should cook it, then signal to him that it was ready for him to share by firing a shot. Some dry fruit and a flagon of Montepulciano would complete the meal. Dantes continued, turning from time to time. Reaching the summit of a rock, he saw his companions 1,000 feet below him. Jacopo had just joined them, and they were already engaged in preparing a dinner which, thanks to Edmund's skill, now had a main dish. He watched them for a moment with a sad, gentle smile of superiority. "In 2 hours," he said, "these men will leave, richer by 50 piastres, and proceed to risk their lives to gain 50 more. Finally, when they have 600 livres, they will go and squander this fortune in some town or other, as proud as sultans and as arrogant as nabobs. Today, hope means that I despise their wealth, which seems to me like the most abject poverty. Tomorrow, perhaps disappointment may mean that I shall be forced to consider that abject poverty as the height of happiness. Oh, no," he cried, "it cannot be. The wise, the infallible Faria cannot have been mistaken on this one point. In any event, better to die than to go on living this sordid and base existence." So Dantes, who 3 months earlier had wanted nothing except freedom, felt already not free enough, but wanted wealth. It was not the fault of Dantes, but of God, who, while limiting the power of man, has created in him infinite desires. Meanwhile, Dantes had approached the place where he supposed the caves to be situated, going along a road hidden between 2 walls of rock and down a path cut by the torrent, which, in all likelihood, no human foot had ever trodden. Following the line of the shore and examining everything minutely, he thought he could see on certain rocks marks which had been made by human hands. Time casts its mossy mantle over physical objects, and a mantle of forgetfulness on non-physical ones, and it seemed to have respected these marks, made with some regularity, probably with the aim of tracing a route, but occasionally they disappeared under great bunches of myrtle, heavy with flowers, or under clinging lichens. Edmund would then have to push aside the branches or lift the moss to discover the clues that led him into this new labyrinth. In any case, these marks had given Edmund hope. Why should it not be the cardinal who had made them, so that, in the event of some misfortune which he could not have imagined so absolute, they would serve to guide his nephew? This solitary place seemed designed for a man who wished to hide a treasure. But could these treacherous marks have attracted eyes other than those for which they were intended? Had the dark and wonderful island guarded its marvellous secret faithfully? Arriving at a point only about 60 yards from the port, but still hidden from his companions by the rocks, Edmund thought that the scratches had come to an end, but they did not lead to any kind of cave. The only point to which they seemed to direct him was a large round rock settled on a solid base. Edmund thought that, instead of having reached the end of the trail, he might, on the contrary, be only at the beginning, so he decided to take the opposite course and retrace his steps. Meanwhile, his companions had been preparing dinner, getting water from the spring, carrying bread and fruit ashore, and cooking the kid. Just as they were taking it off its impoverished spit, they saw Edmund leaping from rock to rock, as light and daring as a chamois, so they fired a shot as a signal to him. The huntsman immediately changed direction and ran back to them. But just as they were all watching him as he leapt through the air, and accusing him of pushing his skill beyond the limits of caution, as if to justify their fears, Edmund lost his footing. They saw him totter on the peak of a rock, cry out, and disappear. All of them dashed forward at once, because they were all fond of Edmund despite his superiority, but it was Jacopo who arrived first. He found Edmund lying on the ground, covered in blood and almost unconscious. He must have tumbled from a height of 12 to 15 feet. They then put a few drops of rum in his mouth, and this medicine, which had already proved so effective with him, had the same result the second time. Edmund reopened his eyes, complained of a sharp pain in the knee, a great weight on his head, and an unbearable stabbing in the small of the back. They tried to carry him to the beach, but when they touched him, even though Jacopo was directing operations, he groaned and said that he did not feel strong enough to be moved. Of course, there was no question of him taking food, but he insisted that the others, not having the same reason as he did to fast, should go back to their dinner. For himself, he declared that he only needed a little rest, and that they would find him better when they returned. Old sea dogs do not stand on ceremony. The sailors were hungry, and the smell of kid was wafting up to them, so they did not wait to be asked twice. An hour later they returned. All that Edmund had managed to do was to drag himself about 10 yards so that he was leaning against the mossy rock. But the pain, instead of lessening, actually seemed to have increased. The old master, who was obliged to leave that morning so he could put off his cargo on the frontier of France and Piedmont between Nice and Fréjus, insisted that Dantès try to get up. Dantès made a superhuman effort to comply, but every time fell back, pale and groaning. "His back is broken," the master whispered. "No matter, he's a good comrade and we can't abandon him. Let's try to carry him to the boat." But Dantès announced that he would rather die where he was than suffer the terrible pain that he felt at the slightest movement. "Well then," said the master, "whatever happens, it will not be said that we left a good comrade like yourself without help. We'll delay our departure until this evening." The suggestion astonished the sailors, though none of them opposed it. On the contrary, the master was a man of such rigid ideas that this was the first time they had seen him give up a project, or even delay it. But Dantès did not want such a serious breach of the ship's rules to be made on his behalf. "No, no," he told the master, "I was clumsy, and it is right that I should suffer for my own carelessness. Leave me a small supply of biscuits, a gun, powder and shot to kill goats, or even to defend myself, and a pickaxe so that I can build some kind of house, in case you are too long in returning to fetch me." "You will starve," said the master. "Better that," Edmund answered, "than to suffer the unspeakable pain that I feel at the slightest movement." The master turned to look at the ship, swaying at anchor in the little harbour with its sails partly set, ready to head out to sea as soon as the rest of its canvas had been raised. "What can we do, Maltese?" he said. "We cannot abandon you here, but we can't stay either." "Leave, leave!" Dantès cried. "We'll be gone for at least a week, and even then we shall have to turn off course to pick you up." "Listen," Dantès said. "If in 2 or 3 days from now you meet some fishing boat or other that is sailing near here, let them know about me, and I shall pay them 25 piastres to take me back to Leghorn. If you don't pass any such vessel, then come back yourselves." The master shook his head. "Listen, Monsieur Baldi," Jacopo told the master, "there's a way to settle this. You leave, and I'll stay with the patient and take care of him." "Would you give up your share in the bounty," Edmund said, "to stay with me?" "Willingly." "You are a fine lad, Jacopo," said Edmund. "God will reward you for your goodwill. But I don't need anyone, thank you. In a day or 2 I shall be rested, and I expect to find some excellent herbs in these rocks which will cure my wounds." A strange smile passed over Dantès' face, and he shook Jacopo's hand warmly, but he was unshaken in his resolve to remain, and to remain alone. The smugglers left Edmund what he wanted and walked off, looking back several times and warmly waving goodbye. Edmund replied with only one hand, as though he could not move the rest of his body. Then, when they had gone, he muttered with a laugh, "It's strange that one should find such proof of affection and acts of devotion among men of that kind." At this, he cautiously dragged himself to the top of a rock that lay between him and the sea, and from there he could see the tartan completing its preparations, raising anchor, hovering elegantly like a seagull about to take flight, and setting sail. An hour later it had completely disappeared. At least, from the place where the wounded man was lying, it had vanished from sight. Then Dantes got up, lighter and more supple than one of the goats that prance around the gum trees and myrtle bushes on these savage rocks, took his gun in one hand and his pick in the other, and ran to the rock which represented the end of the trail of notches that he had followed. "And now," he shouted, recalling the story about the Arab fisherman that Faria had told him, "and now, open sesame!" And I think I'll take a second break there, if everybody's all right with that. I like the fact that open sesame is a thing in this. But yes, I should take a quick 5-minute break. Thanks for the cliffhanger. It's all right. We'll come back after the break. But yes, I hope everybody has a good break, and I should be back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. Hello again. We are back. Are we ready to see what treasure there is in the cave, I guess? I think. Is it a cave? I think it's a cave. I don't know, I was just trying to read on. I shall not read on, I shall not spoil myself. But I hope everybody's had a good second break. God, get 2 breaks today. Oh, it's so chilled. Definitely second one wasn't because I realised my hot chocolate was getting cold and wanted to drink it. Not that at all. Don't know what you're talking about. Nope, not at all. But yes, we shall continue with so many Roman numerals. Chapter 24. Dazzled. The sun had travelled about 1/3 of its way across the sky, and its invigorating May light fell on rocks that themselves seemed responsive to its warmth. Thousands of cicadas, invisible in the heather, produced a continuous monotonous murmuring, while there was an almost metallic sound from the quivering leaves of the myrtles and the olive trees. At each step that Edmund took on the hot granite, he startled lizards, the colour of emeralds, and in the distance on the sloping scree he could see the wild goats that sometimes drew huntsmen to the place. In short, the island was inhabited, bursting with life, yet Edmund felt himself alone here in the hand of God. He experienced an intangible emotion, close to fear, the suspicion of daylight that makes us assume, even in the desert, that inquisitive eyes are upon us. The feeling was so strong that, as he was about to start work, Edmund stopped, put down his pickaxe, picked up the gun, and climbed once more to the top of the highest pinnacle on the island to take a broad, sweeping look at everything around. It must be said that what attracted his attention was not the poetical island of Corsica, on which he could almost see the individual houses, or the almost unknown Sardinia that lay beyond it, or the Isle of Elba with its associations of majesty, or even the barely perceptible line on the horizon on which the sailor's practised eye could sense the presence of proud Genoa and busy Leghorn. No. What he saw were the brig, which had left at daybreak, and the tartan, which had just set sail. The first was about to vanish in the Straits of Bonifacio, while the other, travelling in the opposite direction, was preparing to sail around Corsica. The sight reassured Edmund. He began to look at the objects in his more immediate vicinity. He was on this highest point on the conical island, a slender statue on a huge pedestal. Beneath him, not a soul. Around him, not a ship. Nothing except the blue sea lapping around the base of the island and eternally ringing it in silver. He hurried down, but cautiously, deeply fearing that he might at such a moment have a real accident like the one he had so cleverly and successfully pretended to have. As we said, Dantes had been retracing the notches in the rocks and had seen that the route led to a sort of little creek, hidden like the bath of an antique nymph. However, it was wide enough at its entrance and deep enough at its centre for a little boat, like a speranora, to guide in there and remain hidden. So, by inductive logic, that thread which he had seen in Abbe Faria's hands guide his mind so ingeniously through the maze of probabilities, he considered that Cardinal Spada, who had reasons for not wishing to be seen, had landed in this creek, hidden his little boat, followed the route traced by the notches, and at the end of his trail, buried his treasure. As a result of this supposition, Dantes returned to the circular rock. Just one thing bothered Edmund and upset this train of conclusions. How, without using considerable force, could anyone have lifted this rock, which weighed perhaps 5 or 6 milliers, onto the sort of plinth where it stood? Suddenly Dantes had an idea. Instead of being lifted, he thought, it must have been brought down. And he climbed up above the rock to find where it had originally rested. Here, in effect, he saw that a slight slope had been made, and the rock had slid on its own base before coming to a halt. Another rock, as large and normal as a building stone, had served as a wedge. Stones and pebbles had been carefully moved to disguise any interference, and this sort of little dry stone wall had been covered with soil. Grass had grown there, the moss had spread, some seeds of myrtle and mastic had fallen on it, and the old rock looked as though it was soldered into the ground. Dantes cautiously removed the soil and recognised, or thought he recognised, all the ingenuity of the work. Then he started to attack this temporary wall, which time had cemented in place, with his pickaxe. After 10 minutes' work, the wall gave way, leaving a hole large enough for his arm to pass through it. Dantes went and cut down the strongest olive tree that he could find, stripped it of its branches, put it through the hole and used it as a lever. But the rock was too heavy and too solidly wedged against the rock beneath it for any human force, even that of Hercules, to move it. So Dantes decided that it was the wedge itself that had to be attacked. But how? He looked around like a bewildered man, and his eyes lit on a mouflon's horn full of powder that his friend Jacobo had left him. He smiled. The infernal invention would do his work for him. With his pick, Dantes dug a shaft between the upper rock and the one on which it rested, of the kind that sappers make when they want to save effort, then stuffed it with powder. And, finally, tearing his handkerchief into strips and rolling it in saltpetre, he made a fuse. After setting fire to this fuse, Dantes stepped back. The explosion soon came. The upper rock was lifted for an instant by this incalculable force, and the lower one burst into pieces. Through the little hole that Dantes had first made, a host of fluttering insects escaped, and a huge grass snake, the guardian of this mysterious path, rolled over on its bluish coils and disappeared. Dantes went across. The higher rock, now with nothing to rest against, was poised in space. The intrepid explorer walked all around it, chose the most unsteady point, fixed his lever in one of its cracks, and, like Sisyphus, heaved with all his strength. Already shaken by the explosion, it trembled. Dantes increased his efforts. He seemed like one of those titans who pick up mountains in order to cast them at the chief of the gods. Finally the rock gave way, rolled, bounced, crashed, and disappeared into the sea. Where it had been was a circular area, in the midst of which could now be seen an iron ring fixed in the middle of a square paving stone. Dantes gave a cry of joy and astonishment. No first attempt had ever been crowned with such magnificent success. He wanted to go on, but his legs were trembling so much and his heart beating so violently that a burning cloud passed in front of his eyes, and he had to pause. He did so for only an instant. Then he put his lever into the ring and lifted. The stone, now unsealed, opened and revealed a sort of stairway, descending steeply into the increasingly profound darkness of a cavern. Anyone else would have rushed down it, exclaiming with joy. Dantes stopped and paled, full of doubt. "Come now, be a man," he thought. "We are used to adversity. Let's not be crushed by a mere disappointment, or else I shall have suffered for nothing. The heart breaks when it has swelled too much in the warm breath of hope, then finds itself enclosed in cold reality. Faria was dreaming. Cardinal Spada buried nothing in this cave. Perhaps he never even came here, or, if he did, Cesare Borgia, that intrepid adventurer, that dark and tireless robber, came after him, found his tracks, followed the same indications I did, and lifted this stone as I have, and went down before me, leaving nothing behind him." For a moment he stayed, pensive and motionless, staring at the entrance leading away into the darkness. "Well, now that I am not counting on anything, now that I have decided it would be senseless to cling on to any hope, what happens from now on will merely satisfy my curiosity, nothing more. but he remained thoughtful and motionless. Yes, this is another adventure to be included in the chiaroscuro of that royal bandit's life, in the web of strange events that went to make up the variegated cloth of his existence. This fabulous event must have been inexorably linked to the rest. Yes, Borgia came here some night, with a blazing torch in one hand and a sword in the other, while 20 yards away, perhaps at the foot of that rock, 2 of his henchmen, dark and threatening, searched the earth, the sky, and the sea, while their master went forward, as I shall do, dispersing the darkness with his terrible flaming arm. Yes, but what would Cesare have done with the men to whom he had thus revealed his secret? Dantes wondered. The same as was done, Dantes said with a smile, answering himself, with those who buried Alaric. They were buried in their turn. However, if he had come, Dantes continued, he would have found the treasure and removed it. Borgia, the man who compared Italy to an artichoke which he devoured leaf by leaf, knew too much about the value of time to waste his own in replacing that rock on its base. Let's go. So he went down, smiling sceptically and muttering the final word in human wisdom. Perhaps. Instead of the darkness that he had expected to find and a dense, fetid atmosphere, Dantes saw a gentle glow that was dispersed into bluish daylight. Air and light not only came through the opening that he had just made, but also through fissures in the rocks that were invisible from the surface. Through them could be seen the blue of the sky and the shivering branches of the green oak trees against it, with beneath them a tangled mass of brambles. After spending a few seconds in this cave, where the air was warm rather than dank and sweet-smelling rather than stale, bearing the same relationship to the temperature of the island as the blue light did to the sun, Dantes could see into the furthest depths of the cavern, his eyesight, as we have previously mentioned, being accustomed to darkness. The walls were of granite, spangled and faceted so that they sparkled like diamonds. Alas, Edmund thought, smiling, these must be the treasures that the cardinal left behind him. The good abbé, when he saw these sparkling walls, was no doubt confirmed in his high hopes. But Dantes recalled the exact words of the will, which he knew by heart. In the furthest angle of the second opening, it said. He had only reached the first cavern. Now he must look for the entrance to the second. He sought to get his bearings. The second cavern should naturally extend towards the centre of the island. He looked closely at the base of the rocks and tapped on the wall in which he thought the opening ought to be, having been disguised for reasons of security. The pickaxe rang for a moment against the rock, sending back a flat sound, the solidity of which brought sweat to Dantes's brow. Finally, the persistent miner thought that one section of the granite wall answered his inquiry with a rounder and deeper echo. He studied it with care, and, with the instinct of a prisoner, recognized what someone else might have missed, that there must be an opening here. However, to avoid wasted effort, having, like Cesare Borgia, learned the value of time, he tapped the other walls with his pick, tried the ground with the butt of his gun, and cleared the sand in some suspicious places, until, finding nothing, he came back to the section of wall that had given this encouraging sound. He struck it again, with greater force. Then he perceived something odd, which was that, as he struck it, a sort of outer coating, like the plaster that is put on walls before painting a fresco, was breaking off and falling in flakes, to reveal a whitish soft stone, like an ordinary building stone. The opening in the rocks had been closed with a different type of stone, and this plaster had been spread over it, then painted to imitate the colour and lustre of granite. Dantes struck the surface with the sharp end of the pick, and it sank about an inch into the wall. This was the point at which he should dig. Because of a mysterious property of the human organism, the more Dantes should have been reassured by this mounting proof that Faria had not been mistaken, the more his heart gave way to doubt and even to discouragement. This new experiment, which should have given him renewed strength,
took away the little that remained. The pickaxe dropped towards the ground, almost slipping out of his hands. He put it down, wiped his brow, and went back into the daylight, telling himself that this was because he wanted to make sure that no one was spying on him, but in reality because he needed air, feeling as though he were about to faint. The island was deserted, and the sun at its zenith seemed to be gazing down with its fiery eye. In the distance, little fishing boats spread their wings over a sea of sapphire blue. Dantes had eaten nothing so far, but he could not think of wasting time on food at such a moment. He took a swig of rum and went back into the cavern with renewed vigour. The pick that had seemed so heavy had become light again, and he raised it like a feather and eagerly returned to work. After a few blows, he noticed that the stones were not cemented, but simply laid on one on top of the other and covered with the plaster that we mentioned. He inserted the point of the pick into the gap between them, put his weight on the handle, and was overjoyed to see the stone fall down at his feet. After that, he only had to pull each stone towards him with the head of the pickaxe, and, one by one, they fell down beside the first. He could have got through as soon as the gap was opened, but by a few minutes' delay he put off certainty and clung to hope. Finally, after a last moment of hesitation, Dantes went from the first cavern into the second. It was lower, darker and more frightening than the first. The air which only came through the opening he had just made had the musty smell that he had been surprised not to find in the first cavern. Before entering, he allowed the outside air time to freshen this dead atmosphere. On the left of the opening was a deep, dark corner, though, as we have said, there was no such thing as darkness for Dantes's eyes. He peered into the second cavern. It was empty. It was as empty as the first. The treasure, if there was one, was buried in this dark corner. The agonizing moment had come. There were 2 feet of soil to dig. That was all that remained to him between the summit of happiness and the depth of despair. He went over to the corner and, as if driven by a sudden resolve, attacked the soil boldly. At the 5th or 6th stroke of the pick, iron rang against iron. Never had a funereal tolling or resounding death knell produced such an effect on the person who heard it. If Dantes had found nothing, he would have undoubtedly not have gone any whiter. He dug again in the same place and met with the same resistance, but not the same sound. "It's a wooden casket bound in iron," he said. At that moment, a shadow passed swiftly across the daylight. Dantes dropped the pick, grasped his gun, returned through the hole, and hurried out into the light. A wild goat had leapt above the main entrance to the caverns and was grazing a few yards away. It was a good opportunity to make sure of his dinner, but Dantes was afraid that the gunshot would attract someone's attention. He thought for a moment, then cut a branch from a resinous tree, went to light it at the still smoking fire where the smugglers had cooked their dinner, and returned with his torch. He did not want to miss a single detail of what he was about to see. He brought the torch down to the rough hole that he had started to make, and confirmed that he had not been wrong. His blows had landed alternately on iron and wood. He planted the torch in the ground and resumed his work. Rapidly he uncovered an area about 3 feet long by 2 feet wide, and could see an oak chest bound in wrought iron. In the centre of the lid, on a silver plate that the earth had not tarnished, shone the arms of the Spada family, a sword lying vertically across an oval shield, that being the shape of Italian shields, with a cardinal's hat above it. Dantes recognised it at once. Faria had often drawn it for him. Now there could be no further doubt. This was the treasure. No one would have taken such precautions to hide an empty box in this place.
In a moment he had cleared all round the casket, and revealed by turns the lock in the middle, between two padlocks, and the handles at each end. The whole was worked and engraved in the manner of the time, when art made the basest metals precious. Dantes took the casket by its handles and tried to lift it. It was impossible. He tried to open it. The lock and the padlocks were shut, and these faithful guards did not seem to want to give up their treasure. Finally he put the head of the pickaxe between the box and its lid, and pressed down on the handle. The lid groaned, then broke apart. A wide gap opened in the boards, making the iron bindings unnecessary. They too fell off, though with their tenacious fingers still grasping fragments of the boards. The box was open. Dantes felt faint. He took his gun, loaded it, and placed it beside him. At first he shut his eyes, as children do when they want to count more stars in the shimmering darkness of their imagination than they can in a still light sky. Then he opened them, and was dazzled. The casket was divided into 3 compartments. In the first were gold écus, gleaming with wild radiance. In the second were unpolished ingots, neatly stacked, with nothing of gold about them, except the weight and worth of gold. Finally, in the third compartment, half full, Edmund plunged his hand into fistfuls of diamonds, pearls, and rubies, then let them fall in a shimmering fountain, which gave off the sound of hailstones on a window pane. After touching, feeling, and plunging his trembling hands into the gold and precious stones, Edmund got up and ran through the caves with the wild exultation of a man on the brink of madness. He leapt onto a rock from which he could see the sea, but saw nothing. He was alone, entirely alone, with this incalculable, unimagined, fabulous wealth, and it belonged to him. But was he asleep or awake? Was he inside a dream or grappling with reality? He needed to see his gold again, but he felt that he would not at that moment have the strength to bear the sight of it a second time. For a short while he clasped the top of his head with his hands, as if to hold in his reason. Then he set off across the island, not only running away from the beaten track — there are no beaten tracks on Monte Cristo — but altogether aimlessly, scaring the mountain goats and the seabirds by his cries and gesticulations. Then, by a roundabout route, he came back, still doubting, plunged through the first and second caverns, and found himself confronted by this mine of gold and diamonds. This time he fell to his knees, convulsively clasping both hands to his beating heart and muttering a prayer that God alone could understand. At length he felt calmer, and yet happier, because it was only from then on that he started to believe in his happiness. Then he began to count his fortune. There were 1,000 gold ingots, each of 2 or 3 pounds. Next to these he piled 25,000 gold écus, each worth perhaps 24 francs in today's money, each bearing the head of Pope Alexander VI or his predecessors, and he observed that the compartment was only half empty. Finally, he measured 10 times the capacity of his joined hands in pearls, precious stones, and diamonds, many of which were in settings made by the finest goldsmiths of the time, giving them great additional value on top of their intrinsic worth. He saw the sun go down and daylight fade little by little. He was afraid that someone would surprise him if he stayed in the cave, so he came out holding his gun. His supper was a piece of ship's biscuit and a few mouthfuls of wine. Then he replaced the stone and lay down on it, sleeping for a few hours with his body covering the entrance to the cave. This night was both terrible and delicious, a night such as this man of powerful feelings had experienced only once or twice before in his life. Chapter 25. The Stranger. Day broke. Dantes had been waiting for it for a long time. At the sun's first rays, he got up, and, as he had done on the previous day, climbed to the highest point on the island to look around. As before, everything was deserted. Edmund went down, lifted the rock, filled his pockets with precious stones, and replaced the boards and the iron bindings of the casket as best he could. Then he covered it with earth, which he trampled down and scattered with sand to make the newly turned soil look similar to the rest. He went out of the cave, replaced the entrance, piled stones of various sizes around it, put earth into the gaps, planted myrtle and heather in them, and watered these new plants to make them seem well established. Finally, he covered the traces of his footprints around the spot, and waited impatiently for the return of his companions. There was no sense now in spending his time looking at this gold and these diamonds, and staying on Monte Cristo like a dragon guarding a useless treasure. He must return to life, and take his place among men and in society, with the rank, influence, and power that are bestowed in this world by wealth, that first and greatest of forces that a human being can control. The smugglers returned on the 6th day. From afar, Dantès recognized the Jeune Amélie by its cut and its gait. It was limping into port like a wounded Philocetes. When his companions stepped ashore, Dantès told them that he was considerably better, though he continued to complain. Then in turn he listened to the smugglers' tales. They had certainly been successful, but hardly had the cargo been offloaded that they learned that a brig of the excise from Toulon had just left harbour and was heading in their direction. They took flight at once, regretting that Dantès, who knew how to get so much greater speed out of the vessel, was not there to guide them. The following boat soon came into view, but they managed to escape under cover of night and by rounding the Cap Corse. In short, the voyage had not been unsuccessful, and everyone, particularly Jacopo, expressed regret that Dantès had not been with them, so that he could have his share of the profits they had brought back, a share which amounted to 50 piastres. Edmund remained impassive. He did not even smile when they emphasized how much he would have benefited by leaving the island, and since the Jeune Amélie had called at Monte Cristo only to pick him up, he embarked that same evening and went with the boat to Leghorn. Then he went and sold 4 of his smallest diamonds for 5,000 francs apiece. It might have been inquired how a mere seaman came into possession of such things, but the pawnbroker was careful not to ask. He was making 1,000 francs on each diamond. The next day Dantès bought a new boat which he gave to Jacopo, together with 100 piastres so that he could engage a crew, all on condition that Jacopo went to Marseille and asked for news of an old man called Louis Dantès, living in the Allée de Melun, and a young woman from the Catalan village named Mercedes. Now it was Jacopo's turn to think he was dreaming. Edmund told him that he had become a sailor on an impulse, because his family would not give him money to support himself, but that on arriving in Leghorn he had received a bequest from an uncle who had made him his sole heir. This story seemed plausible enough in view of Dantès' superior upbringing, and Jacopo did not for a moment doubt that his former comrade had told him the truth. In addition, since Edmund's contract of service with the Jeune Amélie had ended, he said farewell to the master, who at first tried to dissuade him, but, having learnt the same story as Jacopo about the inheritance, abandoned hope of overcoming his former employee's resolve. The next day Jacopo set sail for Marseille. He was to pick Edmund up on Monte Cristo. The same day Dantès himself left without saying where he was going, bidding farewell to the crew of the Jeune Amélie with a splendid present, and to the master with the promise that he would hear from him again one day. Dantès was going to Genoa. He arrived at the moment when they were testing a little yacht ordered by an Englishman who, having heard it said that the Genoese were the best boat builders in the Mediterranean, had decided to have a yacht built there. He had settled on a price of 40,000 francs. Dantès offered 60, on condition that the boat was delivered to him that same day. The Englishman had gone on a trip to Switzerland while the boat was being completed. He was not due to return for 3 weeks or a month, so the boat builder reckoned he would have time to start building another. Dantès took him to a banker, who led them behind his shop and counted out 60,000 francs for the boat builder. The latter offered Dantès his services to find a crew, but Dantès thanked him and said he was used to sailing by himself, and that the only thing he wanted was for the man to build him, in the cabin behind the bed, a secret compartment with 3 hidden compartments in it. He gave the measurements for the compartments, and they were completed the following day. 2 hours later, Dantès sailed out of Genoa, followed by the stares of a crowd of inquisitive onlookers who wanted to see this Spanish gentleman who was in the habit of sailing on his own. He succeeded brilliantly. With the help of the rudder, and without needing to leave it, he put his boat through its paces, so that it seemed like an intelligent being, ready to obey the slightest command. Silently, Dantès agreed that the Genoese deserved their reputation as the finest boat builders in the world. The crowd looked after the little ship until it was out of sight, then fell to discussing where it was going. Some said Corsica, others Elba. There were those ready to bet that he was heading for Spain, but some argued just as warmly that he was en route for Africa. No one thought to mention the island of Monte Cristo. Dantès was bound for Monte Cristo. He reached the island around the end of the 2nd day. The ship handled superbly, and he had covered the distance in 35 hours. He recognized every inch of the coast, and instead of making for the usual port, he dropped anchor in the little creek. The island was deserted. No one appeared to have landed there since Dantès was last there. He went to his treasure. Everything was just as he had left it. By the next day his huge fortune had been transported onto the yacht and shut up in the 3 secret compartments of the hidden cupboard. He waited another week. During this time he sailed his yacht around the island, studying it as a horseman studies his mount. By the end he knew all its qualities and its defects, and had promised himself to enhance the former and remedy the latter. On the 8th day he saw a little ship sailing at full speed towards the island, and recognized Jacopo's vessel. He made a signal, Jacopo replied, and 2 hours later the ship had drawn alongside the yacht. There was bad news in reply to both Edmund's questions. Old Dantès was dead, and Mercedes had vanished. Edmund's face remained impassive as he listened to this information, but he immediately disembarked, not allowing anyone to follow him. 2 hours later he returned. 2 men from Jacopo's vessel joined him on his yacht to help him sail it, and he gave orders to make for Marseille. He was not surprised at the death of his father, but what had become of Mercedes? Edmund had not been able to give detailed enough instructions to another party without divulging his secret. In any event, there was further information that he wanted to obtain, and for which he could rely only on himself. His mirror had informed him in Leghorn that he ran no danger of being recognized, and, moreover, he now had at his disposal every means to disguise himself. So, one morning the yacht, followed by the little ship, sailed proudly into the port of Marseille, and stopped directly in front of the place from which, on that fatal evening, they had set sail for the Château d'If. Dantès shuddered a little at the sight of a gendarme being rowed out towards him, but with the perfect self-assurance that he had acquired, he handed over an English passport which he had bought in Leghorn. With this foreign document, far more highly respected in France than our own, he had no difficulty in landing. The first person he saw when he set foot on the Canebière was a sailor who had served under him on the Pharaon, as if placed there to reassure Dantès as to the changes which had taken place in him. He went straight up to the man and asked him a number of questions, to which he replied without the slightest hint in his words or his expression that he recalled ever having seen the man who was talking to him. Dantès gave the sailor a coin to thank him for the information, only to hear the man running after him a moment later. He turned around. "Excuse me, monsieur," the sailor said. "You must have made a mistake. You doubtless thought you were giving me 40 sous, but in reality this is a double Napoleon." "Yes, indeed, my friend," said Dantès. "I was mistaken, but as your honesty deserves a reward, here is a second coin, which I beg you to accept, and drink to my health with your friends." The sailor looked at Edmund in such astonishment that he did not even consider thanking him, but watched him walk away, saying, "Here's some person straight off the boat from India." Dantès carried on, but every step he took brought some new emotion to his heart. All his childhood memories, those memories that are never effaced but remain ever present in one's thoughts, lay here, rising up from each street corner, in every square and at every crossroads. When he reached the end of the Rue de Nouaille and saw the Allée des Mélins, he felt his knees give way and nearly fell under the wheels of a carriage. At last he reached the house in which he had lived with his father. The Aristolochis and the nasturtiums had vanished from the attic roof where the old man's hands used once to trellis them so carefully. He leant against a tree and stayed for a while, thinking and looking up at the top floor of the mean little house. Finally he went across to the door, stepped inside and asked if there was no lodging vacant. Even though it was occupied, he insisted on going to visit the one on the 5th floor, until finally the concierge agreed to go up and ask the people living in it whether a stranger could take a look at their 2 rooms. The little lodging was inhabited by a young man and woman who had been married only a week. When he saw this young couple, Dantès gave a deep sigh. As it happened, there was nothing to remind Dantès of his father's apartment. The wallpaper had changed, and all the old furniture, Edmund's childhood friends, which he recalled in every detail, had disappeared. Only the walls were the same. He turned towards the bed, which the new tenants had kept in the same place. Involuntarily his eyes filled with tears. This was where the old man must have expired with his son's name on his lips. The young couple looked in astonishment at this stern-faced man down whose otherwise impassive cheeks 2 large tears were falling. But as every sorrow inspires some awe, they did not question the stranger, but stepped back to let him weep at his ease. When he left, they went with him to the door and told him that he could come back whenever he wished. There would always be a welcome in their humble abode. Reaching the floor below, Edmund paused in front of another door and asked if the tailor, Caderousse, lived there. But the concierge told him that the person he mentioned had failed in business and now kept a little inn on the Bellegarde road in Beaucaire. Dantès went down to the street, asked for the address of the owner of the house in the Allée des Mélins, went to visit him, and was announced as Lord Wilmore, which was the name and title on his passport. He bought the house for 25,000 francs, which was at least 10,000 more than it was worth, but if it had stood at 500,000, Dantès would have bought it for that. The same day, the young couple on the 5th floor were informed by the notary who had drawn up the contract that the new owner was offering them any apartment in the house at no additional rent, provided they would let him have the 2 rooms that they then occupied. These strange events preoccupied all the regulars in the Allée des Mélins for more than a week, and were the subject of 1,000 conjectures, none of which proved correct. But what muddled everyone and confused every mind was that, on the same evening, the same man who had been seen going into the house in the Allée des Mélins was observed walking in the little Catalan village and going into a poor fisherman's house, where he stayed for more than an hour, asking for news of several people who were either dead or who had vanished more than 15 or 16 years earlier. Next day, the people among whom he had made these inquiries received a present of a brand-new Catalan boat, with 2 seine nets and a trawl net. The good people would have liked to thank their generous inquirer, but he had been seen, after leaving them, giving orders to a sailor, mounting a horse, and leaving Marseille through the Porte d'Aix. And that is where I shall leave it for now.